District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use, but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year and plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Greetings from POMA's annual meeting in Pinewood, South Carolina. I am here for the next few days for I believe we're in our 17th, 18th year as a conference. And if you guys don't know, I am obviously an outdoor media person. I do a lot of writing, content creation, especially from this podcast. I also have done a lot of writing on policy as it relates to hunting, fishing, shooting sports, and the like. So I'm here in my capacity as secretary of Professional Outdoor Media Association to enjoy some fun outdoor activities, which is why this podcast is coming a little later. I'm also having to do some work. But if you didn't see on social media, first and foremost, before I dip into today's quick explainer episode, I caught my largest ever largemouth bass in Lake Marion, South Carolina. If you've ever made the trek down I-95 South to go to Georgia, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, you probably have driven over Lake Marion. I have done that several times on occasion too. As part of field trips for POMA, I was lucky to secure a spot on our bass fishing trips because I haven't done that in a while and I haven't fished, I think, since my Alaska trip in August. That's a long time for me to not fish. So it's unnatural. I needed to get, some time on the water. And I was fishing with Kyle Austin, who is a amateur bass angler. He competes in the Bassmaster circuit, and he also runs a guiding business out of Lake Marion, and he's one of the guides that was matched with our group. And so I fished with Kyle. Of course, he was our guide, and my fishing partner for the day was Jim from Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation, a longtime social media contact who is getting more involved in POMA, and it was really good that both of us settled on fishing with Kyle because he knows his stuff. And briefly for you all, I have never fished with cypress trees, and it kind of reminds me of the Great Dismal Swamp in Chesapeake, Suffolk, Virginia. I haven't gone there, but visually, I felt like I was transported to this portion of Virginia, which is very swampy. So I appreciated that scenery, and casting towards cypress trees was interesting. Obviously, you have to cast your line towards structure because bass, like most fish, love structure. Bass in particular love structure. And so Kyle was telling us that, okay, you have to cast directly in front of the tree. Bass are probably spawning. See what you can do, and you have to let your line sink. So this is spin cast, not bait cast, because we were not fishing with live bait. We were fishing with artificial worms. And so you have to let the line sink down. It's maybe a couple feet deep. I think he said it was between 3 to 4 feet deep, if I heard correctly. So not such deep water conditions whatsoever. So sometimes with my hook set, you probably have this problem too if you're a lifelong angler. Sometimes you're a little slow to react on the hook set. That can be for me, even having fished for a long, long time. Although I haven't really bass fished the entirety of my life, or I've done it by kind of luck circumstances, not using these really professional techniques. But first, I caught a catfish, which injured my thumb. So if you're going to see me over the next few weeks, you'll notice that my thumb is injured. I'm okay, survived, but got a little bitten from that when holding for a grip and grin. So that was kind of a fun surprise. And then this amazing personal best largemouth bass. The pictures don't do the fish justice. And I do have some video that I'm going to be splicing together and editing where you'll see kind of the full scope of the fish a little more because Jim was able to capture it on camera. So I do have some full documentation showcasing the size and girth of this super impressive largemouth bass. Put it into the water after we took some pictures and had stories to go about and tell now that I had done this. So Lake Marion, super impressive. You will hear some more highlights from POMA next week when I am back in Virginia. But I wanted to do this brief overview of two major stories that I feel are important to cover on the podcast today. Let's first start with this new permitting reform bill. So permitting reform is kind of like infrastructure. So everyone always jokes here in Washington, D.C. or in Washington, D.C., because I'm out of Washington, D.C. area right now. But people joke about Infrastructure Week. And in energy and conservation, we always joke about like Permitting Week, or when is permitting reform going to happen? That's always the common refrain that we have. And so with every rule that has been finalized, unfortunately, most of them not very good, especially this permitting rule finalization that I'm going to explain for you. I have a whole guide at Independent Women's Forum for our Center for Energy and Conservation because it was kind of confusing to piece these items all together. So I wanted to write about it in simplified form, and I have it for you. So I'm going to largely read from this blog post that I have for you all, and you could read the show notes to learn more specifically about this. And for me, I was able to deduce from reading this rule that permitting reform is now going to be encumbered by and burdened by having to weigh environmental, social governance, conditions, and posturing, meaning it's going to be a lot harder for projects, environmental, energy, infrastructure, what have you. This rule, the top line item you want to get from this, unfortunately, is on average, I think projects take about 7 years to be approved and greenlit. This is going to, I feel, prolong that process, and it's undoing a Trump-era NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act reform, which was supposed to, if it was adhered to properly, take down the wait time for approval and greenlighting from 7 years to 1 year. I don't think anyone would dispute how wonderful that type of a reform is. So what it does is it inserts this extra criteria into project considerations, and then it also is largely expected to expand wait time and approval time for energy and infrastructure projects. But there may be some carve-outs and exceptions, even with this new posturing angle to it for, of course, their preferred so-called clean energy, solar and wind projects. They're going to certainly give a blind eye to expedite that. They did that for a few wind projects here on the East Coast. So when the government wants to and place extra urgency on a project, greenlighting a project, they do for solar and wind projects. Miraculously, they decide to be efficient for approving that. Not saying I agree with that these are efficient and good projects. I'm just saying they will not hold back and will speedily expedite certain projects of their choice when it comes to new coal plants, natural gas plants for sure, and even nuclear plants. They take their sweet time, and oftentimes they purposely delay projects so they never go online. That is the intention. We see this with the slowing down of oil and gas projects. We've seen this with coal, of course, since the Obama era. And they make it increasingly difficult even for nuclear, even though they're touting the benefits of nuclear, which everyone should. You're seeing nuclear also being forever to be greenlit or to come online, with the exception of, finally, long awaited, with the Vogtle plant in Georgia. But anyway, so why am I concerned? Why should you be concerned about this ESG posturing that is now being accounted for in this White House Council on Environmental Quality endorsed rule? So they're calling this the Bipartisan Permitting Reform Implementation Rule. The NEPA Implementing Regulations Revision Phase 2 is the official title. That's a mouthful. I don't think you have to worry about that. You shouldn't have to worry about that, but that's what you need to know the name is. So I write at IWF that it will expedite the approval of clean energy projects, especially if they accord themselves with environmental justice and they use indigenous knowledge. This is from the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act. So why are these extraneous criteria and standards being inserted into approval or denial of energy and infrastructure projects? This all stems from Biden's Day 1 Climate Executive Order, which does include some ESG posturing. So this is where ESG investing, ESG posturing comes into play. So everything has to be accorded with net zero. So as you've heard me talk about on the podcast, this administration is leaning towards greenlighting in a very expeditious manner solar and wind projects, even without accounting for the trade-offs of going with them or their energy output, which is very poor, their poor reliability standards, and just the environmental impact that these so-called clean energy projects would enact. The various different environmental concerns about land usage, water, everything under the sun. So now that you have to weigh environmental justice, and then you also have to seek out indigenous knowledge, even though that's a very subjective type of metric, leaning on tribal input. Is it tribal input that is going to be favorable only to clean energy projects like solar and wind? That's my guess here, given where we're seeing the trends going and how rulemaking has proceeded and just their gesturing and their posturing in all these different executive orders and news releases since they came to office in 2021. So I believe they're going to seek out tribal input, indigenous knowledge that is favorable to clean energy projects, not that of conventional energy. And then what is environmental justice? Environmental justice is a very subjective criteria too, and what we've seen with supposed EJ proponents, when they talk a great deal about there's a problem, we have to seek justice for these groups that are imperiled by Superfund sites, pollution, et cetera, you see, unfortunately, a lot of noise making happening where from an investigation by Senator Chuck Grassley, he found out that 90% of EJ projects or grants under the guise of fighting environmental justice or fighting in favor of environmental justice goes to overhead, is wasted, is not really stewarded well. So when I hear these two criteria being inserted into consideration for permitting reform to approve or deny energy projects, this has me extremely worried that the process is going to be bungled and that we're not going to have actual energy projects. We just have special interests who are going to be deciding, or as we saw with the announcement, politically timed, of course, to cancel any new LNG export project because they consulted TikTok climate activists to stop that. And then they also leaned on a very faulty study from a Cornell University professor who hates natural gas. So the process is going to be, I think, further hampered and further undermined with outside influence from TikTok influencers if it's insufficiently fighting for environmental justice, if it's insufficiently not leaning on indigenous knowledge. And I write in this that this so-called bipartisan permitting reform implementation rule is very misleading. The Wall Street Journal has said it's very misleading in terms of being bipartisan. And even Senator Joe Manchin, who has been kind of wobbly on, I think, sound conservation energy issues, has started to come home more recently because he is retiring. So it's really not a liability for him to take these more strong positions or principled positions. And he vowed himself rather, that he will be invoking the Congressional Review Act to repeal this. So if he's not liking this, he says that it will lead only to more costly delays in litigation. And it also, in addition to seeking out or leaning on criteria such as environmental justice, indigenous knowledge, not surprisingly in line with net zero, like all this other criteria that is very extraneous, should not have any bearing on a project approval or not. We are seeing that kind of like the Scope 3 emissions rule, they are wanting to mandate that federal agencies assess a project's indirect and cumulative effects on greenhouse gas emissions. It undoes, of course, the Trump-era NEPA rules, which would have modernized the law, and it strays away from the intent of the 1978 law, which says that it's to reduce paperwork, reduce delays, and at the same time to produce better decisions that further the national policy to protect and enhance the quality of the human environment. So this will stray away from NEPA, unsurprisingly, as well. And so if you want to learn more about indigenous knowledge and all this kind of extraneous ESG language posturing that dilutes a project or really undermines true conservation and sound energy policy, and why this extraneous stuff really is just going to lead to further delays and strays away from NEPA, IWF.org on my blog post about this. I want to cap off today's discussion with this update from Florida. So I have railed against lab-grown meat. I think it's a horrible policy if we see the federal government trying to mandate the eating of fake meat, so-called fake meat or plant-based meat, which is oxymoronic. If it's not meat, not made of, beef or poultry or lamb or wild game meat, it is not meat. It is something else, an imitation. Florida, I think, became, I don't know if it's the first official state to ban lab-grown meat or it's one of 4 now, but it's one of the few early adopters. Governor DeSantis announced last week, with the backing and support of Florida cattlemen, that he was going to be one of the first to ban lab-grown meat. I'll read Governor DeSantis's and the Florida cattlemen's positions, and then I'll also read from National Review, which I think has an interesting contrary view, and then I'll offer my own opinion about what I think about lab-grown meat and the policy surrounding it, if we're really truly stifling innovation. So Governor DeSantis said in his press release last week, this law signage stems from a Florida bill called Senate Bill 1084 to prohibit the sale of lab-grown meat in the state of Florida. Oddly enough, it is timed with Jeff Bezos moving to Florida and having invested $60 million into lab-grown meat. And then, according to the New York Post, then Ron DeSantis banned it. So what is the justification that Governor DeSantis leaned on when he signed this bill into law. So according to the press release, he says Florida is taking action to stop, or rather the press release is saying, not governor, Florida is taking action to stop the World Economic Forum's goal of forcing the world to eat lab-grown meat and insects, an overlooked source of protein, quote unquote. While the WEF is telling the world to forgo meat consumption, Florida is increasing meat production and encouraging residents to continue to consume and enjoy 100% real Florida beef. The governor is quoted as saying, today, Florida is fighting back against, and this is May 1st, 2024, against the global elite's plan to force the world to eat meat grown in a petri dish or bugs to achieve their authoritarian goals, he said. Our administration will continue to focus on investing in our local farmers and ranchers, and we will save our beef, end quote. Florida is taking a tremendous step in the right direction by signing first-in-the-nation legislation banning lab-grown meat. Okay, so I wanted clarity. This, I think, is the first in the state, first in the U.S. to do this. We must protect our incredible farmers and the integrity of American agriculture. Lab-grown meat is a disgraceful attempt to undermine our proud traditions and prosperity and is in direct opposition to authentic agriculture, said Florida Commissioner of Agriculture Wilton Simpson. There are several bullet points expanding on what this will do. So it'll modernize Florida's Right to Farm Act to protect reasonable agriculture activities from frivolous lawsuits, signs legislation ensuring that agribusiness operators qualify for protection against property tax assessments when operating on agricultural lands, simplifying the steps for Florida farmers to receive sales tax exemptions for agricultural materials, reestablishing funding for Rural and Family Lands Protection Program in 2022 at $300 million, protecting through the program over 36,000 acres of farmland, and investing more than $2.8 billion into Florida's agriculture industry in the framework for the Freedom Budget. Now let's read from National Review, which I want to get like a conservative alternative in opposition to this. And this will be, I think, a debate we will see politically. I will definitely see this politically in my policy work over whether or not it is stifling innovation to prohibit the sale and procurement of lab-grown meat. National Review, I think, articulated an opposing view, the editorial board, in a very interesting manner. This is not my viewpoints. This is just me articulating what they're saying and relaying it to you, the audience here on the podcast. In concert with the governor's office declaring that the state of Florida has taken action to stop the World Economic Forum's goal of forcing the world to eat lab-grown meat and insects, odd as it may sound, it's true that the ultimate aim of many of these who champion lab-grown meat, or rather lab-grown meat, quote unquote, is indeed to decree that the people of the world enjoy diets that they would never choose of their own volition. Bill Gates, who has heavily invested in this industry, has said all rich countries should move to 100% synthetic meat and suggested that governments use regulation to totally shift the demand. Preventing this sort of dystopian intervention into people's diet is a worthy endeavor, but there's a profound difference between fighting back against mandates and prohibiting consumer products per se, and here Florida has done the latter, and they're arguing. In doing so, the state has taken a wholly worthwhile cause, the cause of individual choice, and sullied it with an unlovely combination of hypocrisy and two-bit protectionism. The editorial continues to say, as such, the act represents an overreach taken with good intentions, no doubt, but an overreach nonetheless. A better approach, they write, would have been for Florida to pass a law that protected the freedom of Floridians to eat whatever they want, that prohibited the use of state money in furtherance of the development of lab-grown meat or any other consumer fare, that reiterated that institutions such as the WEF wield no authority in America and never will, and that preemptively stated Florida's opposition to the claim, should it ever come, that the federal government's Commerce Clause powers extend to the superintendents of groceries. Better still, Florida could have used its referendum system to install these provisions into the state constitution. Instead, it set a precedent that the government can decide what sorts of food ought to be consumed by the citizenry. It may regret that in time. And an interesting voice of opposition is actually one of my colleagues, Mark Morano, who runs Climate Depot. He does not like lab-grown meat, and he had tweeted saying that it could lead to, in essence, the prohibition of tobacco products and other consumer products. So even though he does not like lab-grown meat or Bill Gates, mandating things through these weird kind of gesturing and posturing and these statements, even diehard conservatives have even taken opposition to this. So where do I fall on this? And I don't really need my opinion to be something that has staying power, but I think this lab-grown meat movement is very problematic. I think this fake meat movement is very problematic, and I can see why the governor did this preemptively to prevent, let's say, in the event a federal rule were to be handed down, and the USDA is soon finalizing something relating to labeling of lab-grown meat. I wouldn't put it past this administration to tinker with or, commission a study or do some sort of rule, a nascent rule or what have you. Maybe not this time around, but heaven forbid if we get another term of Biden and company. My worry is they could create rules that would say that you have to welcome lab-grown meat. You can qualify for these tax credits. You can do this as part of, the Inflation Reduction Act, or maybe they will add some sort of provision to the Inflation Reduction Act, an expansion, saying that these fake meat companies will be able to benefit from climate subsidies because they agree with the Biden administration's net zero goals. That's ultimately what these derivative products are aimed at doing. They want to, and the companies say this themselves, investors say this, like I'm not taking this out of thin air. I've researched this myself extensively, but you have heard proponents of lab-grown meat or Beyond Meat burgers or other types of similar fake meat companies say that the goal is to wean people off of their red meat consumption or to make them less reliant on it. And they don't want to compete with beef. They want to replace it or poultry or some other protein source, conventional protein source. And so for me, I could see why and see his justification for preemptively banning this. Now, when it comes to the innovative standpoint and do I think this is going to achieve an ends, I'm a little more murky on that. So I see maybe things a little differently. I don't know if this is exactly stifling innovation because I don't see that there's going to be a market demand for lab-grown meat. It's extremely hard to produce on scale. It's a novelty item. It's going to be first, there's lab-grown chicken that I think Chef Jose Andres is doing with some restaurants, working with one of these companies to do that. So they're selectively putting these lab-grown meat or lab-grown poultry into fine dining establishments first, and then it's going to take them 10 to 15 years for them to scale it if all goes to plan. But seeing what Beyond Meat and all these other companies have endured, huge loss of their stock prices, not real consumer interest or demand, I don't see that there's ever going to be a market for this. So I don't know how truly innovative this is going to be because Americans are very, very particular about what they eat, what they consume, and I don't see this becoming a mainstream product whatsoever, especially naturally, and I don't think it's really bolstering innovation. It kind of sounds neat on the surface, but you're like, there's so many unknowns with lab-grown meat. How is it going to be cultivated? Like, how much in energy are you going to exhaust or expend to build these factories where you're going to have to produce this lab-grown meat? Are you going to destroy high habitat farmland? Are you going to destroy high-quality habitat to accommodate these gargantuan spaces? Are you going to emit more than the cows already do in terms of methane or greenhouse gas emissions? There's so many questions. So I actually see, in theoretical sense, I don't see how this would lead to innovation. I don't see how this would even ameliorate emissions. And I don't like the idea that this would displace farmers and ranchers. They're the guys of fighting climate change and claiming to better the environment. So I do agree with the governor in that sense. Now, is the law going to be effective in preventing this from happening? I'm not sure. I'm not totally against their efforts, but I want to see what's going to happen. And is this, as National Review laid out, could this lead to the prohibition of other things? I don't know if I would like this bill to kind of be an opening of the door, opening of the Pandora's box for that, for other products people may not like, because with the libertarian streaks I have, I don't like that idea. So we're going to see the efficacy of that. But if there was, let's say, a federal law to incentivize, so to speak, but the federal government can't really incentivize products or projects. That's picking winners and losers. So let's say there was hypothetically a rule that would have made it so that the government was forcing behaviors. That's where I think a rule like this or a law like this would have worked more effectively. But of course, if you follow Governor DeSantis politically, a lot of people have criticized his policies in the past and then, certain things somehow turn correct or turn in his favor. And people were like, we misunderestimated you or underestimated you. And you were actually right to take an action here. So it'll be interesting to see if this truly is going to stifle innovation because, like I said, I don't see a market demand for this. I don't see a need or a want or a desire of these meat alternatives. People go eventually back to eating meat because they find out all these different ingredients. They learn how these products are sourced or how expensive it is. This product, lab-grown meat, is not going to be cheap, y'all. It's going to be far more expensive. And again, how much energy expended to replicate meat? And they claim it's, hormone-free and it's humane. And it's just like, it's not the same. It's not going to be conventional meat, the meat that you're used to. And is it going to be just for like the wealthy elites who love to talk a great deal about climate, environmentalism, conservation? So I want to see, what pans out with this. So I don't want to totally write off the governor. I understand the concerns about stifling innovation, and I kind of agree with the assessment that National Review made of how they should have tackled it, to say that no World Economic Forum would have influenced. So maybe the bill could have been crafted a little better. So I am not, for or against this bill. I see merit to both arguments that I've laid out here, but I am leaning on the side on principle of not greenlighting this because I think it's meant to be a means to wean people off of red meat. It's a means to discourage farming and ranching, which they view to be an evil, much like fossil fuel production. So that has me worried. We'll probably see legislation responding for and against this. You're going to see probably in blue states legislation to allow for the so-called innovating of meat alternatives. This is only natural. And states can be kind of these laboratories of democracy where they can experiment. So maybe the DeSantis bill, the law that DeSantis signed into law rather, would make more sense if it was responding to something already in the books or a bad regulation. So I could see why. But to preemptively ban it, I understand why there are people who are criticizing it, say that it'll stifle innovation, be protectionist. But we'll see how this plays out. I think we need to see how this plays out. And again, hopefully it doesn't lead to the prohibition of other products like tobacco or vaping. I think that's stupid. That doesn't relate to our conversation here. If we're talking about consumer goods, I'm just trying to draw a parallel here. But I think it's a dangerous concept, to shift away from traditional meat. And I may disagree with my libertarian friends a little bit here and be like, if there was a market demand, I understand, stifling innovation, sure. But this has more nefarious undertones and overtures. So I could see the justification for why the governor did this. I see both sides here, honest to goodness. And I like the kind of recommendation that NRO had put out there, like what would have been much more effective. So we'll see if other states replicate this. Maybe they'll do something a little more along the lines of what the editors at NRO had proposed, like to prevent outside influences from mandating it in that sense. So it's an interesting story. Of course, people love to attack Florida. That's just how it is. But we'll see what happens with this and if this is truly protectionist or if Florida got something right. Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.